Okay, hello and welcome to another episode of Revenge MoGraph, Reverse Engineering Motion Graphics. Today we're going to do an Iron Man inspired HUD widget element. Looks something like this. So it'd be a little bit of a 3D component here, and we'll do a bunch of shape layer tricks and whatnot. And let's go ahead and we'll get started here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this sort of rounded section here, this section right here. And again, I'm going to do a lot of this with shape layers. And here's my composition settings. So we'll do this. Let's just name this HUD to render. So I'll know this is the one that's going to be the actual final one. And I'll get started here. So what I like to do with shape layers in general is to have them all centered up, and I'll go ahead and make my settings here. 2 pixel white stroke here for starters, so I'll just double click on my ellipse tool and I get a perfect ellipse, but I'll change this to 720 by 720, and then I'll make it a little bit smaller. And what I'll do is I'll set some of these stroke settings. I'm going to make the color more of an electric kind of teal, I guess, and the stroke width will bring that down to 1. So now we have the outer ring here. So what I'll do immediately is I will duplicate this and make a smaller ring. Now what I like to do with the shape layers is I like to work in a certain way, so I'm not kind of repeating unnecessary steps, so I'm more efficient. And the way I like to do this with shape layers is add a lot of my elements into groups. So groups are, you can sort of think of them as folders. So what I'll do in this group is I'll just copy, or rather drag, this ellipse 1 into that group. Okay, and I will then I can almost sort of get rid of all of this stuff here, because all I have to do in this group is add a stroke element, and or I can actually just grab it from here. Okay, and I can pretty much delete this ellipse here. Okay, so again, what I'm simply doing is throwing in these ellipse paths, which I can get from here, and on top of this group I'm going to apply this stroke. Basically the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to get just one stroke value here affecting all my paths. So then I can do something, for example, like duplicate this inner path here and make it smaller like this, and now I have one stroke that's basically applying itself onto 2 separate paths. Okay, and I don't have to constantly come in here and if I'm adding any more stuff in here and have them all have additional strokes here. Okay, then what I will do in the same group is I will make a vertical line here. So again, I'll keep my values the same. I'll just do something like that. So what happens is when I draw elements outside of that group, they don't get into this group here and then have the stroke applied. So what I can simply do is just grab this path, throw that into the group. I can even delete this. And now, see what happens is everything inside this group gets affected by this stroke. Okay, so then what I'll do is I'm going to set some guides in here just so I can get a good sense of the center here. I'll make it half of my composition on the Y 360 by X of 640. Okay, I'm looking over here, by the way, to get my center. I'm going to go ahead and lock the guides here. And now what I can do is grab my path, and I can make this thing, if I turn on, make sure that snap to guides is turned on, I can go ahead and center this thing up. Now this is going to be important because I want to have my shape repeater go all the way around like this, and if I don't move the path of this thing to the center, it won't do that. So then now I can sort of resize this. Again, make sure you've clicked on the path itself here, and I can grab and kind of make this smaller. And what I'm specifically looking for is to get this thing right on the area, in the area between these 2 rings, kind of like this. Okay, if I click away, it'll look something like that. Okay, that looks pretty good, and I can go ahead and turn off my guides here. So there it is. And now what I'll do is on that path here, I'll go ahead and apply a repeater. Okay, now here's the problem. Okay, if I apply the repeater, they all get repeated here. So obviously I don't want them all, I just want this vertical path here. So if I try to put this in here, localize it, or I can actually put this before all the ellipses to localize it just to that one section, which is going to be that vertical line. Okay, so here I can even twirl down, and let's say I want to have 30 copies of this, and I don't want them to go in the x-axis, so I'll just zero that out. And what I do want is to mess with my rotation. So 360 divided by 30 is going to be about 12, I believe. So I'll make it 12 degrees. And now I have them all going around like that. Okay, and pretty good start here. I'm having to only use one stroke to basically make the same amount of stroke width and color for the whole thing. Okay, looks pretty good. Maybe that's a little bit too much in terms of how many of these things are. Maybe I'll make them 20 instead. If I do that though, I have to also do some math. So 360 divided by 20, 18, and there we go. Now we've got our outer ring here with these sort of ruler elements. And now I'm going to continue just making that ring. Now keep in mind that this is all in one group. I can rename this even. I'll call it outer rings. There we go. And now I have them all kind of in this one group called outer rings. What I can even do is, just to keep things nice and sort of efficient here and tidy things up, I'm going to drag this stroke right over the transform, and now if I collapse this, all my outer rings will be in this one group. So the path, the vertical path, which has the repeater, and the two ellipse, they're all contained in this one element called outer groups. Okay, now if I want to add a little bit more detail to this sort of circular ruler, I might even add more of these sort of vertical lines here. One thing that might give me a challenge though is if I do in fact do that. So for example, if I grab this path here and duplicate it, and let's say I recall this one, thinner lines. Okay, I can come in here and try to mess with the repeater and the thickness and all that to get them how I need. Another way I can do this is to actually move this thing below the repeater, make another group, and I'll move this right below the repeater. I'll call this, like I said, thin marks, and I'll drag that thinner line in there, although I misspelled thinner line. Let me correct that. Okay, and the reason again why I'm doing this is because in here I could also have a separate thickness to my lines here. So for example, if I do in fact grab a stroke object, I could make it a different color, a different thickness. I'll go ahead and make it the same color as my outer kind of stroke area here. I'll just do a sample of that. But I do want to make it thinner, so I'll make the stroke width 1. Okay, and so in here, again, I'm just in this group called thin marks. I'm just putting in a thinner vertical line and stroke on that. And in here, I basically change the color and the stroke width. Now, in here, I can also add its own repeater. Okay, and again, if you twirl this up, it gets kind of put right between the transform and the stroke. And here I can do a custom repeater that doesn't get affected by this repeater. So here I can go ahead and maybe do, let's say 60 copies. Again, I'll come in here and reset some of these values, especially the X position. Now 360 divided by 60 is going to be 6, so I'm going to make my rotation 6. Now I get all these sort of sublines here, and they're a little bit too thick, and I can go ahead and do a 0.5 maybe on those, or maybe even a 0.05. But that's not really going to work. So again, one of the things that usually happens is when you do in fact put even its own group in another group, you're still going to get affected by the stroke of this. The sort of solution would be for me to just do a very simple thing, and that is just grab my thin marks, just completely drag them out of that whole group. I can even put them up here like that. And now I have an outer rings and a thin marks section in here. Okay, maybe I'll move this in the bottom. And now this should have its own set of parameters. So if I do a 0.25, I get much thinner lines. So basically the whole point here is the way I like to work with shape layers is mainly using groups. And you can also, as you can see here, I'm using just really one shape layer. And in this one shape layer, I have my outer rings and my thin marks. And again, this is a group I renamed, and this is a group I renamed. And inside this group, I have these parameters. Inside of this group, I have these parameters. Okay, again, to generate the two thicker outer rings and one thin marks going across like that. So I can even come in here and maybe do a 0.1 just to make them really, really sort of subtle, and kind of be done with that section here. So overall, I'll rename this outer rings. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time spelling things today. Outer rings and thin marks. Okay, and that's one section ready to go. So if you look at my example here, I basically created this part. Okay, now let's go ahead and do a couple more things here. We're going to start kind of putting things in 3D space. So the way I like to work with this is if I turn this into a 3D object, so this whole shape layer now is a 3D object, I can work with this in a couple different ways. If I, for example, turn in front view, it's the same view as I already have. And this kind of helps me align things. But I can also take a look at this from custom view 1, and if I use my unified camera tool, I can also see this thing in perspective. Okay, so this is kind of how I'm gonna go back and forth and try to do a preview of what this thing will look like in 3D. So if I'm done with this, I'll go ahead and set it back to either active camera, or more importantly, or more accurately, the front view. Okay, and now we'll continue to add more elements. So if I look at the original example here, we have a couple of these elements in the back, and then I'll just do the same basic thing. I'll create this the same way I created these two outer rings. So let's just do these three right now. So I can keep putting things in groups in here if I want to. That's not a problem. But it might get a little messy, so I'll just make another new shape layer here. Again, I'll do it the same exact way. Make sure nothing is selected. Double click, and let's reset this to, let's say, 500 by 500. Okay, and this might be like a dashed element. I'll immediately make it 3D, and I'll show you why I'm doing that. If I put this into custom view 1 again, right now they're kind of sitting on top of each other. Let's call this dashed ring. And now I can immediately move this thing back in 3D space. And if I use my unified camera tool, I can see how far back. And I can also make this thing a lot, well, not a lot, but just a little bit smaller here. Just make it maybe something like that. And maybe that's a little bit too far back. I'll kind of move it forward a little bit. I'm also in world space mode if you're curious, and I will change between these two as needed here. Okay, and then here I'll I'll make it again that same blue color, and this time I'll just go into my dashes, create a dashed element, and I can mess around with this. There's a little bit of bunching up going around here, and I can mess with that as needed. One thing I like to do is turn off the mask and shape visibility, so I can actually do this and see what's going on. And also, if I need to, I can even turn off my layer controls. That way I can concentrate on my dashes here and see that I'm not getting any kind of bridging or overlapping. Okay, so there we go. Now we've got two of these elements, and maybe I'll make the dashes a little bit more of them, and make them maybe closer together. So if I mess with this, maybe something like that would be good. I'll leave it up to you how you want your dashed line to look. Dashed ring, rather. Okay, so there we go, and so that's the dashed ring. And if I do a couple more of these, I can put them more and more in 3D space. Maybe what I'll do is I'll call this dash ring. Okay, so after I made the dashed ring here, I'm going to make another sort of I'll just duplicate this, and this one I'll call, maybe I'll just do a regular ring. I'll just call this a regular ring. And I will put this, as far as the 3D space is concerned, I'll go ahead and put that also in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and select it, and I'll move this back on the Z-axis. Again, I'll use the Unify Camera tool to kind of check where I'm placing things. This one I will make smaller, as a little bit smaller, and maybe I won't have the dash part of this. I'll just make this normal, solid, and let's move that a bit closer in here. Okay, so now I've got two rings that are inside here, and I can probably, I can probably just add another one here. Maybe I'll make the thickness a little bit smaller. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make another element here that is going to be these sort of meters here that go up and down on this front section. So I'll start simply enough with a just a horizontal line here. Maybe I'll make my thickness 3, and I'll just draw out a very small line like this. I'll make it 3D so I can see it, and I'll go ahead and move these points here to make them closer together, thereby making a smaller, thinner line here. And to keep things nice and centered up, I'll go ahead and move this whole thing, holding down Shift, to the center of my composition here, and center that as well as best as I can, because it's not snapping to the center here on the Y-axis. And maybe I'll just bring this up a bit as well, just to match the example I just showed you guys. So here, I'll go ahead and rename this, meters 01, and I will in fact come in here, and here's my shape layer here. I'm going to bring in a repeater. So let's do that. By default, it wants to go on the X-axis. We'll get rid of that. Position of the transform, make that 0. So what I'm going to do is on the position of the Y-axis here, I'll change that to -1. So thereby it will put 3 copies right on top of each other. So what this basically is doing is it's if we have a negative value here, it's actually going to push these lines upwards. So if I do that too many times, so I don't want to have gaps, so I'll just make it about right there, maybe about a -3. And then if I increase the copies, it will in fact give me as many copies as I want, going straight up, and thereby creating a solid line. Okay, so maybe I'll do something like that. Again, I can come in here if I need to and mess around with the thickness of this by altering its path. So I can just move these closer together, perhaps holding down Shift, and try to get a thinner line here. Okay, maybe something like that. Now, I do want to put a wiggle expression on the copies here. So if I hold down the Option key, click on the stopwatch, I can type in, for example, wiggle 5, comma, let's do 6. That'll make it 6 pixels offset from 14. And if I play this back, which has something that looks like that, maybe I'll change this 8. Just give me a little bit more variation there. Or actually, let's do 12. There we go. Now, there are several different ways to do what I'm going to do next. One of them is just duplicating the layer a bunch of times. So I'll show you that way first, but there's another way of doing this. Same sort of effect, but I'll just do sort of the simple way first. Yeah, let's try that. So let's go ahead. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to click on this little equal sign here, and I'm going to make this 8, just so that it's not going too far up, then turn it back on. And the way I turn it on and off is by clicking this equal sign. Okay, so the easiest way for me to do this without doing any kind of repeaters or controls and whatever is to just basically duplicate this as many times as I want. But before I duplicate it, I want to put an expression on the second copy. So if I click on my meters 1, hit Command D, hit the R, and for the Z rotation, I'm going to go to the expression here, and I will type, for example, index times 5. Okay, that way it's going to basically rotate it on the Z-axis. So every time I duplicate this now, I'll have a bunch of these guys kind of going across like this. And I'll do as many copies as I want, and sort of get this sort of 90-degree arc here. And if I play this back, I have something that looks like that, for example. So now what I can do is grab all of my meters here and put them all into a pre-comp. And let's call this one also meters. Meters 01. Okay. Now it's going to disappear because every time you pre-comp something, it loses its 3D property. So if I click on this little continuous rasterization collapse transformation button, I should be able to get that back. And now I have it here. I'll also turn the 3D back on so I can move this in 3D space. So I can also scale this up, bring it to where I kind of want it to be, like this. Alright, so now if I look at this from, let's say, the custom view 1 here, go into my unified camera tool, I can see where these guys are actually located in 3D. So I'll keep them, I think, there for right now. I might move them, maybe I'll move them back actually a little bit, and rotate around and see where I put them. Alright, looks pretty good. And again, at any point I can come in here and mess around with their thickness or the wiggle property, that kind of thing. I could also colorize this. So if I wanted to put in a fill effect on this, by default it turns red. I can come in here and give it a slight orangey glow, or rather an orangey color. And I'll just kind of give it a little bit of color there to contrast with the blue, and we'll keep it something like that. Okay, now next element. I have a bunch of more of these things here, so let's try to do this element here. This is just going to be a series of shape layers as well, so let's go ahead and mess around with those. So I'll start off with again putting this into front view here, and let's just make it fit. Let me bring this down a little bit more. So it's very similar to the other process. I'll grab my pen tool here, and I'll just draw out. I like drawing these things out to the side so I can sort of have a better look to them here. And I'll make it 3D here, and kind of want to make this a little bit different in terms of look than the others. So what I'll do immediately is I'll change the stroke here from butt cap to round cap, and change the color. Let's just make it a little bit more of a bluish hue here. And now we have the front, or the first part rather, of that. And here I'll go ahead and duplicate this. So I'm gonna, let's call this whole thing meters 02. This one I will call blue. I'm having spelling problems today. Blue line. I will duplicate that, and I will change this one to, let's just call this small orange line. And I'll move this down a little bit, so I'm going to grab my path here and I'll move it down, and I will make it smaller. Just select this path here, and this one I will change its stroke to maybe like a bright orange, just sticking to my blue-orange palette here. So if I click away, I have something that looks like this. Let me zoom in on that here. And let's go ahead and fix a couple things. I'll make this closer together. And maybe something like that perhaps. Maybe I'll make the blue one here. Let's select that path. Let's make the blue smaller here. And let's make the orange smaller as well. Okay, so I have these elements lined up. Let me make this brighter. Okay, now again, the main thing with a lot of these elements is before you add any repeaters or before you add anything to make this thing duplicate, I want to center it all up. And so a lot of times I'm dealing with guides here, and after I create this to the side, I kind of want to center everything up. I can solo this, and I can select both of these paths. So I'll select this one, hold down Shift, select that one, and I should be able to fairly easy slide this over, have it snap to the center. Okay, so since I'm doing round repeating here, it's going to make a lot more sense if these are all centered up. So now I have my orange and blue lines centered up. I'll go ahead and start messing with repeaters here. So first thing I'll do is I'll mess with my blue line here, because I want to do a repeater per each one of these elements here. So I'm going to grab a repeater, and I want to make sure that it's in the blue line only. Okay, so if I twirl this up, you don't want to see it outside. So you want to make sure it's inside the blue line. And I will reset its position here to 0. Okay, now I want to do a little bit of experimenting here, so I'll make maybe like 20 copies, and if I increase my rotation, I should be able to sort of eyeball what I think looks good in terms of its spread here. So that's a little bit too far away. There's too many gaps here, at least in my opinion. So what I'll do is I'll decrease the rotation, and I'm going to hold down the command button as I do that to give me a little bit more control. So maybe something like that would be a good spread. And then I'll increase the copies, also holding down command to make them sort of go out until it meets right about there perhaps. So here's a good, I think a good spread here. And basically at this point what I can do is to animate the copies here. So I can option click on the stopwatch, our friend the wiggle expression, and this time I will do, let's say 8 comma, and since we're starting at about 38 copies or so, maybe I'll do 20. That way it goes 20 either way. And let's see what we get here. So there we go, maybe something like that. And maybe I kind of want to play that down a little bit, so let's try making 10 copies, and let's see what we get if we turn back on the wiggle expression. Okay, so let's go ahead and maybe change this to 10, because I don't want it disappearing completely off here. Alright, that's not too bad. And again, I can do a little bit of trial and error. I can maybe make this 15, turn it back on, and I have something that kind of does its copy wiggle like that. Maybe I'll do 15 as well here. Okay, one thing I can turn on, by the way, is my end opacity. I can make that 0. Makes a nice effect, a fade out at the end here. Great. Now I can probably copy this repeater here and put it into my small orange. So let me do a Command D, and I will put this repeater 2 inside the small orange. That way they both get the same sort of amount. And I can vary this if I wanted to. Obviously, I can go into my repeater for my orange and maybe give it a smaller starting point, like 5. Make sure to turn it back on, and now I have a slightly different look. So if I turn back my other layers, clicking on the bullet here, I can see what I'm getting here. Now it's getting a little crowded here, so maybe what I'll do with this one is I'll rotate this as a whole layer. Maybe just have it appear on this quadrant. So if I do a Z rotation, I'll maybe go 90 degrees or so. And now I have it on a different quadrant, and maybe I'll make it smaller as well. Alright, so now we've got something that looks like that. And again, I'll probably switch this to Custom View 1. Let's see where I am 3D wise. So maybe this element I'll keep forward. Yeah, that looks good. That's the other element here that kind of recreated with shape layers. Again, it's this element here I'm working on. Now you'll eventually see me put a glow on all this, and obviously this was done with a glow, and I'll get to all that in due time. Alright, so far, just to kind of show where we are here, here are our elements, and I'm using the repeater in slightly different ways for the first quadrant and the second quadrant there. Okay, now on to another element here. This time what I'll do is I'll make this sort of a blue, yellow, and red element here, and I'm going to use the same shape layer tricks, but this one's going to be a little more complicated. It's going to be a little bit more involved, but I think it's also going to be a little more powerful, because this gives me, this next method that I'm going to show you, give me a lot more control here. Okay, so let's get to that. Okay, so we'll start off as we've done before. Let me switch this into my front view here, and I'm going to grab the pen tool, and I will do just a small vertical line like that. Let's go ahead and make it 3D, and I will solo this, and what I'll do immediately is I will bring this towards the center, and I'm going to grab my shape layer here, and I'm going to actually try to do a decent job of naming these things. So let's call this spikes. Let's call this layer, let's call this blue spike for obvious reasons. And I'm going to add a new group in here, make this sort of the holder for all the spikes. So I will do let's do spikes holder. Okay, so then I will grab my blue spike and I'll put it into that folder, just so that everything is organized in here. Okay, now I will go to the blue spike path, and I will go ahead, make sure your guide snapping is on, make sure you're clicked on the word path, and then it should be able to be snapped pretty much towards the center, horizontal center. Now the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to have to rely a lot on centering things. So in this particular case, I'm going to move this down so that the top control point here is actually snapped to the center. So in this case, I will in fact use the center snap for that. And again, you just have to drag until you feel it snap. Okay, so that's kind of where I want my first spike to be here, and I'll do some more things here. I'll make this like a 2 thickness. I'll change this to a blue color, since that is what it's named, and I have here a blue spike. Okay, and I'll twirl these down so you can see it in its holder here. Okay, now the way I'm going to do this is I kind of want the blue spike to be just a little bit off center. So if I go into the blue spike transform anchor point, I'll go ahead and decrease it a little bit to give me some room here for another element. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I will duplicate the blue spike. Let's rename this orange spike. And this one I will go ahead and also change some parameters. I can actually just delete fill. I don't need fill. Stroke, I will go ahead and make it like an orange color. Maybe something like a bright orange like that. And I will in fact now click on its path and move it towards the center, and I will make this smaller, and let me make sure I can grab both of these, and maybe I'll use my up and down shift held up and down arrow keys to kind of move this into more accurate position. Alright, so now we've got these. I'll make even smaller on this here as well. And this one I am going to make sure it is centered on both the X and the Y position here. Maybe like that. Okay, so the bottom spike here, it's off-centered mainly due to the anchor point in the transform, about a -15. Maybe I'll bring that a little bit closer, maybe like that. Maybe -12 here. And the orange spike is centered, and I'll do just one more here. Let me reference my original. So I'll do one more, and this one will be red. So I'll duplicate the orange, rename this red spike, and I will now go to the path and move this thing up. I'll make it just a little bit shorter than the blue spike. Careful moving these things around. They can be a little bit hard to control. And I will make this one a reddish color. Okay, and this one I will also, actually let me do this a little bit more like I did the blue one. I'm going to grab this, make it snap towards the center with just the bottom. So if I just move this thing, it should be able to snap towards the bottom, the center rather. And then I'll go to its anchor point transform, and let me go ahead and reset this because it was set to -15. I will also, just to make sure that the orange one, let's make this also 0. So, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I need to actually, every time I duplicate this, I need to reset that anchor point. So I didn't do it for the orange, and I didn't do it for the red. So now that I've done that, now I'll go ahead and turn off the eyeball temporarily for the orange, for the red rather. Go into the orange, and again I will click on the path. Let me twirl this down so I'm not selecting the wrong one here. Path, and I will move this down towards the center. Yeah, that's one step you do definitely want to make sure, is that when you duplicate these things, it will have a -15 because the blue has a -15 in the anchor point, or -12 rather. So go ahead and make sure when you do duplicate these, you reset the anchor point to 0 on the orange, and to make sure it's centered. Now the red one, I also had to reset it. So if you go into the red anchor point at 0, 0. Let's turn it back on. But once I do that, I need to once again go to its path and make sure you bring it down to the snapping center here. Then offset it anchor point in about 12 positive, so it matches the blue. So just to kind of go over this again, everything should be set to 0 initially for the anchor point, and then this one is offset minus 12, this one stays at 0, this one is offset plus 12, all the anchor point. And I'll show you why this is very important in a minute here. Okay, so here's my initial series of spikes here, and as you can see, there's a folder that holds them all called the spikes holder. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I will at this point now use the transform of the spikes holder, and I'll increase this to about so, just so that it's not directly centered. You can see my values here. Okay, I'll close this up. Now I'm going to add a repeater to this, and the repeater is going to be very important where it goes in terms of its hierarchy. So I don't want to put it inside the spikes holder. I want to put it actually outside. So I'm going to click on the word contents. Then I'll add a repeater. Okay, and I want to make sure it's on the same level as contents. So maybe I'll even drag this so it's underneath the word contents, just to make sure it's on the same level. And then I'll put it just above the transform. So what this is going to do is, once I go into the transform here, I'm going to zero my position now, just as I did before. Let's make copies about 12. And if I increase my rotation, this will in fact go around the center, just the way I want. Okay, and you can sort of mess around to taste here. So if you want to get it perfectly on the so it's going from 90 degrees in this arc, you could play around with a couple of these values. So maybe I'll just do something like that. Let's just do an 11.5, or actually let's do 11, and now I have 11 at about 9 degrees between them. Great, now I have all of my blue, orange, and red spikes ready for the next step. So again, this is the kind of hierarchy you want to, let me just go over this one more time here. Let me move this up a little bit. So we have a contents folder under the spikes shape layer. It has another folder there called spikes holder, which in itself has 3 folders called red, orange, and blue spike. And we've done the transform on the anchor point there, and then brought in a repeater, which allows us to, in a 90-degree angle arc, have about 11 copies. Now, I'll click on the word contents, or actually I can click on the word repeater, and I will add something called a wiggle transform. So what this is going to do, and I'm going to specifically put this after the repeater, is it's going to sort of randomize the scale on the y-axis of not just this group, but per individual spike. Let me show you what I mean here. If I come in here, I'm going to leave these values alone for a while, and let's just make this maybe 4 seconds here, 4 wiggles per second. So this wiggle has its own transform. I know there's a lot of transforms here, but if I go to my scale and I'll uncheck the uniform, I can bring in my y percentage down, maybe minus 50. And if I play this back, you'll see all of these spikes here are being sort of randomized in the y scale. And again, it's not just per group, it's per individual component here. Okay, so I can make that smaller. Maybe I'll do a minus 40, and it won't go out as much. So that is how I basically have done that element here. The only thing that's different from my look at it is there's more of them. So if I come in here and maybe do 20 copies, I'll lower my rotation down, compensate for that. So maybe something like that. And now I've got them as I need them. I can also individually, if I want, I can go through these one by one and make, for example, let's say the blue path is a little bit too long. I can come in here and manage to control it. So I'll just bring it in smaller. And I can do that on all of them if need be. Okay, great. So that is how I have done the spikes element here. So let me unsolo that, and let's go back into our custom view 1. And here what I'll do is just give myself a little bit more room. Maybe I'll rotate this on the z-axis 90 degrees so that it's not hitting where the other elements are. So if I play this, I have something like that. And I can always just go ahead and use my Unify Camera tool just to see where everything is. Okay, and I guess for right now I can keep these where they are, right on that bluish ring. Although maybe I'll move them back. No, maybe change my mind. So let's click on spikes. Let's move this sort of away from the blue larger ring here. Great. Play this back again. Here is my element here or rather here is my HUD here with a bunch of different sections here. Okay. To be a little bit more efficient, I can always just duplicate this. Maybe this one I will move to the other side. So let's just bring it around. Maybe I'll do a 180 or so. I can always make it smaller. Bring down the scale. And now I have it perhaps on the other side just to reuse that element here. Okay, great. So that is starting to look good. Let's see what else. Let me go back into my original. Okay, so now we've got this sort of element here. That I'm going to add this sort of randomized kind of waveform element down here at the other quadrant, and I will do that in an even different way. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to grab an audio element. So I have, just an audio element. It doesn't have to be anything specific. I will bring that into my timeline here. Now this one is just audio, so I need actually something to have this effect work on that is video. So I'll just make a new solid. Doesn't matter what color. And I will pre-compose these two together. So layer, pre-compose. And I'll call this just audio. And I'll go ahead and make it 3D as well. And I can turn off the speaker icon because I don't even need that on to hear anything. Now in my effects, I'm going to grab something called audio spectrum. Okay, and if I apply that to this layer, if I solo this, we'll just see something like this. And the first part of this, you won't see anything happening because there isn't any audio there, but we'll fix that. So what I will do is I'm going to kind of move this forward a little bit, or I can go into my original here, hit L twice to reveal where my waveform starts, and I'll just move this so I actually have something for it to latch onto. And I'm gonna see what I have here. Now a lot of these elements, they're kind of or a lot of these sort of waveform elements here, they're really kind of small, so I'm going to increase the maximum height. And now I get a little bit more height there. And I'll change my side to just A, so it kind of goes up only. Let's crank this up a little more. Okay. I'm going to temporarily turn off the 3D here so I can work with this. So I want to make this like a roundish element here. So I'm going to grab the Ellipse Tool, and if I have my layer selected, I'll hold down Shift and I can generate a circle. Okay. I don't want it to be a full circle, so if, in other words, if I turn on my mask 1, this thing will be a full circle. Instead, what I can do, let me turn this back to none. Before I do that, I can click on my mask path, grab 2 of these points, go to layer, mask, and shape path, and uncheck closed. What that will do is it'll split my mask here, and I will just carefully delete those nodes that I don't need. So I just have this sort of one arc here. Then I can turn back on mask 1, and if I play this back, you'll just see it show up on that one segment. Okay, great. So let's change some more values here. Maybe what I'll do is I'll change these guys both to that same blue I've been using. So I'm going to grab my color picker here, carefully select that blue, solo this again, and now I have these elements. And that was a pretty quick way of doing that. So let me go ahead and turn everything back on, and if you see, make this 3D, and you'll see that element show up here. Let's go ahead and kind of center this up a little better. So I'm going to go to my front view again, and I'll kind of scale this up. So I'll bring that almost to the edge of this inner blue circle here, and maybe I'll also rotate this on the z-axis, kind of bring it down here, perhaps -90. Increase my scale a little bit more. Go back into my custom view 1, and let's just see where it put. Yep, so kind of put in the same z-axis or z-depth as the outer ring here. So let's do a little playback. Okay, it's pretty good. I'm trying to do my best here not to have these sort of bunched up more than they need to be. So what I'll do maybe here on this element is I will move that, scale it down, bring it in a little bit. Okay. Great. All right. So I think we're pretty good with this whole system I developed here in the back. So again, I could keep adding more and more elements. I could try to sort of fill up certain areas that might need more density, but I think I'm pretty good at this point. Okay, next thing, I'll go ahead and start working on this sort of overlay here to the actual piece here. But before I do that, let's go ahead and work with some glows here. So, okay, so I will make a new adjustment layer, and here is where I will apply that glow effect. So I'll put that on here, and by default you don't really see anything that's happening here, and that is because we are in 3D space. So this adjustment layer also needs to be in 3D space. So let's turn on the 3D checkbox, and I'm getting some glow here based on my original colors, and I can I can come in here and control the radius, crank that up, the intensity, all kinds of things to get you what you need with your glow. I could also come in here and duplicate to the glow if I wanted more sort of intense glow that you don't get, which is the single glow effect. So maybe I'll just use 1 for now, and I can get rid of this. And if we play this back, we have something that looks like this. Okay, so the next thing I'll do is, if you look at the original example, I am going to add this element here that's used as an overlay above the widget here. So let's go ahead and work on that. So I will also start with making this into my front view, and I'm going to bring in a layer I did in Photoshop here. So if I bring this in, make it 3D, and it kind of looks like this. I'll just temporarily show you with a fill command. So this is sort of the shape I'm working with, but before I do anything with fill, I'll go ahead and right click on this, and I will create shapes from vector layer. Okay, what that does is simply translates this Illustrator layer into, if you look on the contents, group 1, you'll see that it's now a path. And I can actually turn off or even delete this try layer here from Illustrator. And you know, let's go ahead and make it visible. I'll make it white. And I'll just solo this so I can sort of have the focus on that. I'll rotate this whole thing. Let's go into the path. If I double click, I can go into my path scale mode here, which allows me to rotate. Hold down shift to get 90 degrees. And now I'll do a series of merge commands just to basically shape this like so. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is I will, in the same group here, I'll grab a rectangle. Okay, and this rectangle, again, if you go into the rectangle path, I'm going to go and convert it to Bezier shape. Then I will double click on it and move it kind of like so, so I can reshape this thing a little bit and maybe move it out here. The point of all this is that eventually what I'll do is somewhere in this group I will add a merge paths, and what that does by default is it combines them. But if I change this into subtract, I get that same stroke filled with a color, but now it's subtracting at the rectangle shape. Okay, and I can also come in here and add on to this something like, for example, rounded corners, which if I crank up the radius a little bit, I get something that looks like that. Okay, so this is kind of how I made that shape. The final two things that I made was, if I come in here and grab, let's say, an ellipse, I can also convert this into a Bezier and then bring this into, I'll make it smaller first, and then I'll just bring it kind of on the edge here, like so. Let's make it smaller. And I'll duplicate that one more time and then bring this down. Whoops, don't want to do that way. I'll bring it down, double click, and bring it down to the other side here. Okay, something like that. And all of these shapes should basically be subtracting from the original shape here. So what I mean by that is this is the original shape, and then these three are subtracting themselves from that by the merge paths tool set to subtract. Alright, and now we are ready to go. Again, I might need to just slightly move a couple of these around. So I'll just move this a little bit higher using my arrow keys. And finally, I will go ahead and bring this back into my composition here. So if I uncheck the solo, I just want to make sure that it looks okay. Now if you look at the QuickTime movie here, you'll see that there's a bunch of stuff going on here, so this will be a good opportunity to convert this whole thing into its own pre-comp. So let's go to Layer, Pre-compose, and let's just call this try element and make it 3D. And I can now work on this independently while keeping this on my screen here. So lock this down first, then double click. I can actually work into views here, so whatever happens on the left, you'll see it update on the right. Okay, so let's go ahead and make this. If I go into my rotation here on the z-axis, I can rotate this 90 degrees like so, but on the pre-comp I'll go in the opposite direction so I can sort of see this thing laid on its side while I work on it in a more front vertical manner here. Main reason for this is it'll be easier for me to create these sort of meters going in either direction here and then have it translate here. And again, I can come in here and move this kind of where it will eventually end up. somewhere like that, perhaps. Maybe I'll raise this up a little bit. Okay, now what I'll do first is I'll make a series of more kind of volume units, but they're going at a arc, so it's not going to be the full circle. But I will take advantage of my shape layer tools with the repeater, just like I did before. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just do a simple vertical line. Okay, and make it 3D. And on here, probably be a good idea for me to add some guides here. Actually, they're already there, so good. Let me just make sure they are exactly where I want them to be. So let's see, if I go into my lock guides, just want to make sure that this is exactly at 640, and it is, and this one is exactly at 360. Good. Okay, now I can come in here and lock guides. Again, the main reason for all of this is I'm trying to sort of keep this thing more or less straight in the center, so it'll be easy for me to make those meter elements. So I might even have to come in here, you know, grab some of these paths in here, and I'll just put them into the center like so. Okay, so then I'll go back into my shape layer here, and just like we did before, we want to move the path only so that it snaps towards the center like this. Now this element is going to be kind of a yellow-orange color, so I'll just make it like so. I'll come in here in my stroke, and I'll make this a round cap. And if I zoom in here, I can always control the size of this thing. So let's make it a little bit smaller. Great. Now, once we do that, everything is centered up, we can go ahead and add the repeater to this, and it should automatically more or less give us a circular center. Again, what I'll do is reset the position. Let's make 20 copies or so, and then rotation, I'll just crank this up. Let's say something like that maybe. And let's go ahead and kind of fix this. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, so let's move this up. Maybe like that. Okay. Now if I want to make this wider still, I can always just bring this whole thing up and have less copies. So if I bring my copies down, then what I can do is on my transform of the actual shape, I can bring that down so it sort of matches a little bit more of the curvature of that. So again, I can make my copies more and then bring down the, under the transform, bring down the rotation amount. So I get a little more density there. And to make this thing kind of fit the curvature of this little overlay here, I just went ahead and moved the anchor point, because when I do that, it just keeps that arch, but it doesn't make the radius smaller of this. Okay, I think I explained that. And I can also come in here and maybe even work on the rotation just to push that a little bit off center here like that. Okay, pretty good. Now, again, I can animate the copies. That's just a simple wiggle expression again. Let's do 5, comma, since we're at 18 copies, let's maybe do 13 either way. Close this off. And now we've got it doing its thing. Looks like 13 is a bit much. So let's make it, let's try 8. Turn it back on. Or maybe even less than that if I bring it to 5. I just don't want it to go outside this perimeter here. So maybe even 3. Okay, good. Now let's keep going along with this, and we'll make a very similar looking element. If we duplicate this, let's duplicate this. First we'll name it orange bars. Duplicate that. Let's name it blue bars. And here, again, what I'll do first is I'll just work on the path. So if I bring this thing down like so, maybe make it a little bit longer for the blue ones. Let's go ahead and make them actually blue. Okay, and they have a very similar feel to this. And maybe here I'll just vary the expression. So if we go into the repeater, let's make this maybe quicker, 10, and let's do maybe 1. Or better yet, let's have it start off smaller, let's say 9, and then make this like 5 or so. Alright, so there we go, a little bit different feel to that one. Let's make this 9. Okay, cool. Then I can add a couple more things here. So if I reference the original, here it is. There's another kind of layer here that has slightly more thick lines. So let's try that. I will duplicate all of this, Command D, and let's name these teal bars perhaps. Same basic process. I'll go ahead and grab the transform of this shape 1 this time. And again, I will move everything down. Try to match the angle. I'll make my scale smaller. And then I'll move it back up. Okay, this time what I'll do is I'll make the stroke a little bit thicker, so I'll make maybe like a 5. Let's go ahead and make the distance between them a little bit more. So if I go to the repeater, transform the repeater, let's increase the rotation. And I don't want this going out, so I will, at this point, turn off my expression for copies, bring down the overall number. And while we're there, let's change this into like a teal color. Maybe something like that. I will go ahead and increase thickness even more. Maybe the angle needs to be a little bit larger. Let's do that on the actual transformer shape one. So again, what I'll do is I'll scale this maybe up a little bit, and then bring this down on my y-axis. And maybe make less copies to start with. Let's do maybe 8. Alright, let's see what that looks like. Turn back the expression back on. Okay, pretty good. Maybe overall I can spread these out a little more, so I'll go back into my transform of my teal layer here. I'll position and bring this down, and then sort of align the blue in the middle of these. So let's go to the blue one, and we'll reveal its transform on the y-axis. Just give it a little more space between elements. Alright, looks pretty good. Then I'll work on the other side. So the other side, what I'll do is I'll make a similar set of arcs here, but I'll do all that animation with a simple audio file here. So again, I'll grab my audio file. This is just some random audio from a voicemail or something. New solid. Combine these two together. Turn off the speaker, and I will apply my audio spectrum to this. So audio spectrum. Before I do that, I'm going to make this 3D layer audio spectrum. Okay, and again, by default, it wants to come in as a solid line here. Maybe what I'll do also is if I go into my original layer here, make this longer. If I hit L twice, I can see my voice or the audio starts a little bit later, so I'll push this more to the left. Great. So now if I play again, there's not much happening in terms of how I want it to look. So what I'll do is I'll in a similar way I did the original audio on this, I'll do the same thing here. So I will grab an ellipse here, draw it out, and before I do anything to this thing, I'm going to make sure that it sort of matches at least a little bit how this top arc is here. Might need to bring it up a little bit. Okay, then I will click on the mask path, select a couple of these guys, and go to Layer, Mask, Shape and Path, and uncheck Closed. And then now what I'll do is just delete the ones that I don't need, because I just want this arc right here. Okay, cool. And then I will, in my audio spectrum preferences here, I will choose that in the path window. And now you can see that it's on that path. It's still way too big for this, so what I like to do is just make another node here, and then delete this one, and then move these guys kind of where I want my two nodes to be. Careful when you select them, so you're not selecting just one. I'll put it right about there. So here what I'll do is I will change this to side A, or actually side B. Raise my maximum height so I can see this a little bit. And I'll change this to just, let's just try like a greenish color on both of these. Okay, so I'll reshape this a little better here. I'm going to go to my pen tool, kind of click right around there, and delete there. So now I have it sort of matching the opposite side here. Now, you know, you can always come back here, and if you go into the mask path, you can always rotate this thing to get slightly better results in terms of the angle to match this orange part. But I think I'm okay with that. Let's just raise this up again, max height, and maybe what I will also do here is change this from digital to analog lines to get something like that. So let me decrease the max height in that case. Cool. All right, next I'm going to just duplicate a couple of these things, you know, and try to have different looks to them as I move them down. So duplicate the audio, bring this down, and this one I will just make it white, perhaps all white here. I can also change the way it looks because right now it's in sync perfectly with this. Offset audio here and get a slightly different variation on that. If I need to make this shorter, I can do that same trick. Just click somewhere in here, add a point, and then delete the one that's hanging off here. Cool. And then one more. I'll do another duplicate, move this one down even more. And this one, what I'll do is I'll just start with a blue color. And I'm not going to keep it blue. What I'll do is crank up the hue interpolation. And what that does is it kind of adds a little bit of a rainbow effect there. And I'll limit the, again here, I'll go into the path of this. And I will also trim it as well. There we go. And maybe on this one I'll change it up again, I'll use analog dots or something. And let's just do both sides. Okay, so now we've got some pretty quick elements here. And like I said, I like to work in this view so that I can have it isolated and see how it updates on the right here. So the next thing I did is I went ahead and I added a new adjustment layer. But this time I'll put this thing all the way at the bottom, make it 3D, and apply a fast box blur on this. Okay, now you won't see anything happen here because it's in the bottom, but watch what happens in the original composition there. Let me just unselect all these. So if I crank this up in the blur radius, you see it starts to blur all of this stuff underneath, okay, which is fine, but what I really want to do is just blur it on the bottom of my shape here. So what I will do is, like you can put masks onto adjustment layers. So what I could do is I can just draw out a similar shape. It doesn't have to be accurate at all. You'll see why in a second. See, it already captures it. Because what I can do is on my original try outlines here, I have that path, the actual shape in that path, so I can just click on this, Command C, and paste it right into that mask path as well, Command V. Okay, so here it is. And then if I just do my thing with rotating it and kind of lining it up, I can get almost the exact match here. Something like that, perhaps. I might even trim this out, which is probably a good idea. So let's go ahead and maybe I'll just make my life easier and just add another point here, another point there, and more or less we got what we want. So now we can see that underneath. Okay, great. So now we've sort of done our main try element here, and if I look at the animation, play this back, I'll go ahead and switch this to Custom View 1. Now we have this overlay element being sort of blurring beneath whatever's underneath. So now let's go ahead and concentrate on animating this thing as it moves, sort of oscillating back and forth. And the way I'm going to do that is basically with a null object here. So I will grab a new null. Okay, and let's go ahead and make it 3D. And I'm going to go to my Unified Camera tool, rotate this thing around so I can sort of see where everything is. And I will move the null back on the z-axis. So let's just rotate around. And maybe that's a little too far, so I'll bring this forward a little bit. So what this null is going to do is going to drive the rotation of all the elements, basically. So they all need to be basically children of this parent null object. So I can even rename this thing, master orbit or something. And I will in fact grab everything. I might not need to do the adjustment layer, but let's just grab it and parent it to the master orbit. So now if I click on the master orbit, rotation in the y-axis, it should be able to kind of move this thing as a almost like a 3D element with a bunch of these, although they're technically 2D layers. Okay, so that is the goal here. So I'm going to start at frame 0 with a Y rotation of, let's say, minus 15. Actually, let's make it plus 15. Keyframe. Go maybe about a second forward, or maybe 2 seconds. And now I'll do minus 15. So if I play this back, I get a good amount of rotation here. I will go ahead and make these both into easy ease. And more importantly, I want this thing to continue. So what I will do is option click on the stopwatch, type in the expression window loop out, capital O, type equals quote ping pong. Okay, close it off. And now we have this thing going back and forth. So let me play this through. Great. So let's just use our unified camera tool here, and let's back out a little bit. Maybe rotate it more forward as a starting point. Move it a little bit more center. And let's take a look. Great. One thing I'll do just to tweak this a little bit is maybe I'll move the try element. Let's put this into front view here. I'll just bring this down on my y-axis here. Let's bring this down, kind of center it up a little bit more. Bring it back to custom view 1. There we go. It seems to be a little bit more in line. And one final step that I will do is I'll just add a, any good widget needs a random number being generated. So I'll grab my text here. Let's take a look at this in the front view. And there's an expression that I found online that we can put into the source text. So I can put an expression into this that I found online. Option click on the stopwatch, Command V. Here's the expression if you're interested. Again, I'm not a programmer. This is just some JavaScript that I found online that generates a 4-digit random number. Okay, so you can take a look at this if you want to know exactly. And make it 3D. And let's go ahead and make this thing center. So first thing I'll do is I'll make sure that it's center justified. To really put it in the center, what I really need to do is turn off the rotation of my master null here, the master orbit. So let's go ahead and temporarily turn off that expression, make it 0, and then I will put this in the center, more or less. Let's change this to custom view 1. Let's see if I want to bring this back any. Maybe I'll bring it back a little bit. Just push this on the z-axis. And then the final thing is, of course, parent it to that master null. So next thing I'll do is I'll turn back on my rotation. I'll come in here and do +15. And if I hit play, it should still retain that back and forth rotation once I turn back on my expression. Okay, great. So now, again, you can come in here into your main composition, use your unified camera tool to rotate how you want this to look. So what I can do to lock down my, if I wanted to lock down my perspective, I'll bring in a new camera. Let's do a 2-node camera, so one node will always look at the center. Let's do a 35mm lens, hit OK. Then if I look through the camera, I get my camera view, which now I can use the unified camera tool to sort of rotate this around any way I want and have this thing be at a perspective if I want. So maybe something like that. I can also center it up, same tool, and even zoom out as well. So if I play this back, let me rotate this a little more. Maybe I'll go to frame 0 here and rotate this so it's not so sideways here. Let's take a look at the final render here. Here it is in real time. Okay, great. One final thing, if you want, make a new adjustment layer. If you want to turn down some of these colors, make it 3D as well. I can go to my effect, color correction, hue saturation, and maybe turn down a little bit of the color spread here. So just turn down the master saturation. And maybe have something a little bit more muted if you want. Actually, I don't need to make this 3D. And then on top of this, I can also add maybe another glow effect to this. Maybe it's too much at the default, and let's turn this down, maybe a 0.25, and then just make this slightly more glow-ish in intensity here. Alright, so that pretty much concludes this episode of Revenge MoGraph. Please like, subscribe, view, comment, and I'll be sure to make more of these.